Thanks very much to all of our speakers. I'd like to quickly move to a Q&A, but maybe do we have some questions straight away from the audience? The system's slightly complicated. You'll find a microphone in the chair, in the armrest of your armchair. If you're interested in asking a question, please raise your hand. Okay. If you could identify yourself and the organisation that you represent, please. Do we have any other questions while okay, good, please. And if it's directed at a particular one of the panelists, that would be useful.
Hello, I don't know if it's working. Okay, it is. Poppy Bullock, journalist from MLEX. My question is for Jan Panik. We've seen just on the panel today, there's a bit of a difference in opinion on whether this should be a directive or a regulation. The Commission proposed this as regulation, but I'd like to know your thoughts on the change to a directive. Is this something that the Commission would find satisfactory if the change did go ahead? Thank you.
Yep, sure.
Well, we proposed originally a regulation for a number of reasons. Some of them actually coincide with what was on Paul's slide. And we continue to believe that indeed regulation is the right instrument to achieve the objectives that were set forth in the beginning of the process. We understand that there is a mixed opinion in the Council and in the Parliament, where there are quite strong voices advocating a directive as the most suitable instrument. We know that this is also the strong view of the industry, but in the Parliament and the Council, I believe the situation at the moment is more nuanced. And we respect that the two co-legislators need to have all the possibilities to ponder the issue. So we don't want to preempt the discussion neither in the Parliament nor in the Council. My commissioner said that he's ready to be pragmatic, that we want a good result. We want to achieve the effects, the maximum possible of the effects that we decided to follow when we proposed the legislation. If the co-legislators believe that the way to achieve that is rather through a directive, we are certainly ready to look at such an alternative. But I think for us at the moment, regulation fulfills most closely the purposes of the initial intent. And it's against the design principles and against the key goals of the legislation, as enshrined in our original proposal, that we would be judging any amendment or suggestion for change.
Mr. Bellet,
just adding to the remarks that Jan had made and asked to your question from the Parliament point of view. I myself have tabled the proposal to change from regulation to directive, but we are well aware of the fact that within the Parliament, especially within the Envy Committee, but also within the Energy and Industry Committee, a lot of MEPs mistrust, if I may say so, some member states or the member state when it comes to the implementation of directives. So, and that's why a lot of colleagues stick to a regulation for the time being. And in this context, I would like to add, Simon, that whether we talk, whatever the legal form, whatever a directive or regulation, member states will have to do a lot of homework. They will have to, also within a directive, they will have to invest and set up independent. We talked about independence; it's crucial. Independent, competent authorities that have enough expertise to follow what's happening on the ground offshore. They will have to invest in the independency of the verifiers, of the verification mechanism, and of course the Commission will monitor that, and will regulation also within the directive. The Commission will monitor what the member states will be doing and won't be doing. So I think that doesn't make that a lot of a difference. Member states will have a lot of homework and will have to realize it within the implementation timing that will be foreseen.
Just to pick up, though, if I may, on something that Steve said, question to you, Mr. Panik, is this idea that a regulation would divert precious resources away from improving safety performance. What do you say to that argument?
I don't believe that, and I haven't seen any convincing material evidence that would support that, and I believe it's the other way around. That's why we actually opted for regulation. One of the reasons why we opted for regulation was to not only to have the direct impact on the industry, as Paul said, but also to speed up the implementation and to to ensure consistency in the application of the legislation. With the directive, you do not have the direct applicability. You set broader framework within which member states need to adopt law which transposes the directive. There you have an opportunity for diversity. If you want to still achieve consistency, I believe there is quite a significant amount of follow-up work to be done, which certainly will not make it much lighter for member states in general compared to regulation. I don't see the materiality of the counter-argument.
Okay, Steve, Mr. Panek has said he hasn't seen any convincing evidence that regulation would divert resources. Do you have that evidence?
Well, I got this evidence from Steve Walker of the HSE in the UK, who said that he would need to get a lot more regulators in to do inspecting, to look at this new paperwork. So that's where my source of information is. And I also believe that the Norwegian regulator has said that he will also need to bring in a lot of resources. Now that comes to another issue there, is actually this competent resources. The industry is very short of competent resources, and it's not just a case of simply going out and hiring people. These people would effectively be working for governments, so they're effectively civil servants. But the people who are experts in this industry, to the extent that they can actually look at a well and review a well, they are competing for jobs which are effectively drilling engineering jobs. And these drilling engineers are getting as much as £1,000 a day. So once the regulator actually trains up someone and brings someone up to that standard, the first thing they do is go and join industry. So we're ending up with a lot of problems keeping hold of good regulators to keep that independence. And so that's the evidence on that area. But the whole question of the regulation versus directive, in states where there is no existing regulation, certainly it would be worthwhile bringing in something new. But in states where the systems are already in place, that would be a major issue. So generally, for member states who don't have anything in place, then there won't be a difference. I agree with that. But where the 80% of the oil and gas is actually being produced is where the impact is going to be.
Can I let Jan come back on that? And Paul, you wanted to say something?
There is a difference, and it's not, as Steve says, that for member states that do not have anything at the moment, it won't make a difference. It will. With the directive, they will not. With the regulation, they have a set piece, and if it's a minimum regulation, as was said, they have a basic stepping stone immediately, right there on the day of adoption, quick start. With the directive, they have to go through the whole process of transposition with presumably not really well-established, independent in-house expertise in the administration, etc. So they will actually have a lot more complicated path to walk than if they were provided with the regulation. I agree that with those that have already laws in place, regulation would require them an effort to actually make that legislation merge with their existing legislation. I do not, however, believe, and I don't think there is a convincing, conclusive expertise that they would have to that it would wreak havoc in their existing legal system, and they would have to throw everything out of the window and replace it with something coming from Brussels. I think there are ways of coping with a new regulation in an existing field where a local national legislation already exists. I mean, after all, this is not the first legislation that the EU adopts, and it may be that with a directive, they feel that they will be able to do less work. But as Mr. Bellet said, I believe even those with existing legislation will need to do quite a lot of homework, because we are asking everybody to improve their systems. What we try to do with the proposal is to pick up on the best practices that demonstrably exist in individual jurisdictions, or that we are told by experts, including the industry. I mean, we've been provided with quite a lot of input from the industry, that people believe that could be achievable, even if they do not exist at the moment, and build from that an amalgam regime. So even the best practitioners at the moment will certainly find themselves in a situation where here and there they need to extend their existing legislation, and rightly so, because even in the best advanced jurisdictions, when they actually have an introspective moment, they do recognize that there are things to improve.
Okay. Paul, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just very briefly to say that obviously, I mean, the EU needs to strike the right balance between an efficient legislation, between bureaucratic oversight, overdose, and that is why we have this long tug of war between the institutions. But when it comes to resources, you know, when you see, I mentioned that in Norway, we have a very good regime. But that doesn't mean that we do not see incidents where there are, you know, pretty serious incidents that have not been followed up, that have not been investigated. And even in a resourceful country as Norway, there is a lack of resources. So then we believe the EU has a very important role to play to ensure that, you know, you have to enhance that. Because with all due respect, it will be difficult to sell to the public at large or to Ivo Billet's colleagues that this industry can't afford to have a sufficient amount of resources to enforce the safety. The resources are there. There are enough people in Europe who need jobs to fill as well.
So if you wanted to come back, and then we had another. So we have two questions. So if you just make a quick comment, and then we'll take some more questions.
Could you just go back to your slide on regulation? Look, I think this will prove the point. Just go back to the slide on the back regulation. Next one. Here we are. Okay. So looking at this slide, which was the Bologna slide, our regulations need to harmonise the safety. We all agree that there needs to be a harmonisation. There's no disagreement with that. A directive would achieve that. Direct application on industry, yes. A directive would still have direct application on industry. I believe it would. Why would it not?
No, but the directive is exclusively addressed to member states, and it sets obligations only on the member states. Directive, by definition, the only obligated party is 27 member states. Full stop. Sorry. This is the law.
So why do we have directives at all then, if they're not going to? What's the point of a directive if they're not going to do it?
They are extremely useful in a number of situations.
All right. Okay. I think we've heard the exchange of views. We had one question here, one here. Maybe I'll take two or three at once. So starting with this gentleman, then you, then the gentleman here. We'll do three at a time, and then we'll. Okay. Sam, if you can introduce yourself and say who your question is directed to.
Yeah, it's all right. Jan Hansen from OneTech, we're a small energy consultancy. I'd like if some of the panelists could elaborate a little bit on the state of play when it comes to neighboring countries. You touched upon it in this little debate on regulation versus directive, but we should remember it's fine to discuss Scotland and the UK and Norway with a very well-established regime for safety, but we shouldn't forget that the biggest growth we have in European or near European waters is in the Eastern Med. It's off Cyprus with Israelis and Cypriot and lots of other companies operating. It's in Libya in the Middle East, in North Africa. It's in Russian Arctic. Is the aspect of neighboring countries something that touches upon this?
My name is Michalis Papadogiannakis. I work for the European Commission, Director General Environment. A question for Mr. Kromal from industry. Aren't you afraid that in the case of a directive, industry would be confronted with different standards? Because the member states, as Mr. Panek explained, will transport the directive probably in a different way. So they might well adopt different standards. So you might be confronted with different standards, also taking into account the different legislative structures in the Mediterranean than in the Atlantic.
Okay, and don't answer it now. I see we're not going to get away from the directive versus the regulation debate, but there's a lot to be said about it. Gentleman with the beard there.
Thanks very much. Matt Hine from the UK Permanent Representation. I mean, I'd like to say for a start, because the UK has been a leading member state in pushing for a directive in this area, the UK wants to see the highest standards in the EU. The UK system is based on continuous improvement to the highest standards, and we've learned from some very hard experiences on that, and we've got a system that comes from Piper Alpha, really. Over a period of 20 years, we kept looking at higher standards. I mean, I've got to say, I'm slightly disappointed that Jan said he hasn't seen any evidence of the increased regulatory burden of a regulation, because I distinctly remember sitting in some very long energy working groups explaining to him exactly the point that Steve has made, that will invariably cause us to divert resource from actual implementation of safety into effectively changing the rules for no apparent increase in the long term of the safety standards. I mean, on the issue of transposition, I'm afraid I don't really see how a directive being put into immediate direct application in 30 days from adoption of the proposal actually is better than a directive where you have to transpose over 2 years. I mean, just saying it's a regulation isn't going to improve instantaneously the standard of safety in the countries we're talking about. And finally, just one final point. In the current circumstances of the financial crisis, when 14 member state heads of state, I think, signed a letter on better regulation last year, it seems to me to be very odd that to put in place regulation that impacts upon, well, the 3 member states that do 90% or so of the drilling in the EU are the UK, the Netherlands, and Denmark, all of whom have an effective, globally recognised regime. To put the impact for a much smaller impact on the countries that you're worried about, it seems to me to be bizarre in the current circumstances. Thanks very much.
Okay, wasn't really a question, but I'll indulge you. Are the panel thinking about the impact in neighbouring countries? I mean, there's an issue of the global scope or application of the EU rules for EU companies. Are you worried about uneven? Shouldn't the industry actually be worried that it would be for the industry's disadvantage if there were uneven transposition and implementation of the directive? So in fact, some of the countries would be, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to sum up the question. And to turn Matt's comments into a question, is it unfair that this legislation is being targeted disproportionately at 3 member states?
Whenever you're ready.
Steve.
Okay.
So, I have some more questions, so if you keep your answers nice and punchy.
So I'll answer the second question. Different standards. I said that there were some things in this legislation which we like the look of. This is one of the areas we like the look of. If we can get the same standards for all the way across the EU, then I can take a rig from the UK and put it into Danish waters, into French waters, into German waters, and I will save myself a fortune in paperwork. Because at the moment, it is an absolute mess. So that is one of the things that we like. We do like standards, we like ISOs. We can force people to follow those standards. Excellent. So that's the first part. The second part was outside the EU. This document represents OGP. It's a global organization. We are doing the global thing, not just for the EU, but for the whole of the globe. This has been affected in America. I'm actually going over to Rio next week. I've got an invitation to go over to New Zealand who are looking to try to explain to them what's in this document. And we've talked about cherry picking. This document contains the cherries from 100 experts. All we are saying is, here's a bunch of cherries, use these for your cherry picking exercise. So we are going global.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, first to respond to Matt, I fully acknowledge that there has been a lot of evidence thrown at us. What I said is that I haven't seen convincing, conclusive evidence. We've been involved in numerous discussions with the UK. We appreciate them very much. They are extremely enriching to the process and helpful. We have been presented by various statements and argumentation, but I think we are ongoing we are continuing in the discussion. I don't think we have concluded bilaterally or with anyone that we have reached a consensus on this yet. So convincing and conclusive evidence. What was the other question?
Uneven implementation or transposition.
Well, indeed, I would really. It's the intention. One of the intentions that, indeed, as Steve says, there is a rig that enters European waters. It is brought to the highest possible standard of operation, and it then can be reliably used in various areas. The best way not to get that and to remain with what Steve characterized as a mess, which there may be, may not, I don't know, but he said it. In any way, the best way to stay with the status quo is to go with a directive, where again we end up with plethora of understandings of individual jurisdictions or individual legislatures, national legislatures, how that particular requirement is to be transposed or that particular requirement is to be understood.
The other question was about what happens in third countries, and I guess what's behind it is, does it put the EU at a competitive disadvantage if we're applying standards that...
And there I think it's clear that we do want to work with the industry, because it's evident that it is the industry which is predominantly European that actually holds the keys to the most advanced technologies and holds the keys to a number of important operations across the world, and hopefully for the benefit of European economy, they will be continuing to hold increasing role in globally. So that's why we want to work with them in third countries. I think what we need to be able to work with them for the benefit of also the third countries is to come with a credible story. I mean, Steve is proposing a story that the industry may have, and good luck to them proselytizing it. We would love to join them by coming with them to, or in parallel to the third countries and say, look, Europe is a strongest, coherent, robust regulatory system. Let us dance.
Mr. Bellet.
Yeah, I will be brief concerning the third countries, especially. First of all, of course, all candidate countries for countries that want to become a member of the European Union, of course, they will have to implement European legislation. But neighboring countries, I suppose that it could be, and perhaps is already part of the so-called neighborhood policy of the European Union, to take that on board and to make it mandatory to apply the same standards that we use in the EU, and to make them also mandatory for neighbor countries. With regard to the Arctic and the third countries over there, and a lack of level playing field, suppose that we would agree on a ban, on a moratorium for drilling in the Arctic. Of course, that's not feasible when Russia and all the other countries go ahead. So I think that the only solution there is to be found in within the Arctic Council, and try to get and try to reach for a binding instrument, a binding agreement within the Arctic Council over there. And then last remark with regard to the remarks that was made by the UK permanent representation, I believe, with regard to the high standards, especially by UK and other countries. I think that we also have to wait for the final report with regard to the Elgin incident. I think that's not yet available, and of course we wait for the lessons to be drawn from that incident, whether it was pure luck or whether it was efficiency. So we wait for the final outcome.
Okay. Paul, do you want to come in? Otherwise, we have a couple of questions. So
very briefly,
thanks.
just to bring in to re-emphasize the point about the learning aspect. I mean, there is a not negligible aspect here that we have to have a sharing of expertise and sharing of experience. And all the good work that has been built up in Norway, in the UK, in Holland, in Denmark, what is the best and most efficient vehicle to ensure the spread of this learning? Well, we believe very much so that it is a regulation.